Hi and welcome to Pamphlet Global. Now today I'm going to talk about, a multitude of factors are there which basically will determine whether there will be a long-term ceasefire between the Americans and the Iranians. But among those multitude of factors, there is one very critical factor, and that factor is about Iraq. And no, it is not about who's going to win on the battlefield in Iraq, but it is about who is going to control the parliament of Iraq, because it is a very, very critical factor on who stays in power in Iraq, whether it will be somebody who is going to pivot more towards the Americans, or whether it is going to be somebody who's going to pivot more towards the Iranians, as previously was the case with the previous Prime Minister of Iraq. Now, this is somewhere where both the Americans and Iranians are looking at a strategic compromise. And let me explain why Iraq is so important in playing a role in a long-term peace agreement between the Americans and the Iranians. Because Iraq is the third largest oil producer in OPEC. It produces about 4.5 million barrels of oil per day and exports around 3.5 million barrels per day as well, which is 90% of that passes through the Strait of Hormuz. Political transition in Iraq is very, very critical to both the US and to the Iran to maintain future control over the Strait of Hormuz. It will also be a key factor in deciding how the conflict ends in West Asia, as I have previously said as well. And all the bets are now placed on the new PM-elect of Iraq, Ali Al-Zaidi. Let me explain why Ali Al-Zaidi is very, very central and very critical to all these things. Basically, the selection of Ali Al-Zaidi as the Prime Minister designate on 27th of April last month represents a high-stakes balancing act between both Washington and Tehran. The situation is a classic example of what we call a strategic compromise in Iraqi politics, where both the US and Iran appear to have found a figure they both believe that they can influence. What is the US administration's stance on basically, Ali Al-Zaidi? We all know that President Trump is somebody who apparently looks at good disposition towards Ali Al-Zaidi. And it is largely a product of a negative selection, what we say, is because it only stems from one idea that anyone apart from Nouri Al-Maliki, the ex-Prime Minister of Iran. So that factor plays big on Trump's mind. In the beginning of this year, Donald Trump publicly and very aggressively warned Iraq against bringing back former PM Nouri Al-Maliki, labeling him as an Iranian puppet and threatening severe economic sanctions on Iraq in case he's brought back. Now, Ali Al-Zaidi is somebody who also has a technocratic appeal to him. He's a 40-year-old multimillionaire businessman and a banker who has no prior government experience. The Trump administration offer favors that kind of a person in power because for them a dealmaker archetype and a political outsider is favored over a political insider. Now, by selecting a businessman over a career sectarian politician like Maliki, the Iraqi Coordination Framework successfully for now has lowered the temperature with Washington. That is how things are at the moment. What is the economic leverage which the US is looking for from this appointment of Ali Al-Zaidi? The US for now has signaled a very, very cautious approval, likely seeing Al-Zaidi as a pragmatic figure who can be pressurized via Iraq's dependence on the US dollar and the banking system, areas where Al-Zaidi as a banker is highly vulnerable. Now, currently, US banking systems maintain a very tight control over Iraqi oil exports. Within the US administrations, however, there are people who are extremely critical of Ali Al-Zaidi because they are labeling him as the IRGC man, and that allegations are on Zaidi because they suspect that Ali Zaidi is IRGC man due to his financial history, which is very closely bounded with the Iranians and the coalition that has nominated him. The coalition, the nominators who are there, they are the ones who have put forward his name and it's called the Coordination Framework of Iran, which basically has chosen Ali Al-Zaidi as, the face of the new Prime Minister of Iraq. And this is a bloc which is very heavily dominated by the pro-Iran factions. Now, it's very certain that they would not have selected him without seeking guarantees that their core interest and those of Tehran would be protected in case he is able to successfully, prove his majority in the Iraqi parliament. Also, the banking ties Al-Zaidi has are a bit questionable because he was a previous chairman of the Islamic South Bank, one of the several Iraqi institutions US had recently sanctioned or restricted by the US Department of Treasury for allegedly facilitating the laundering of dollars to Iran and to its proxies as well as to IRGC. Now, there seems to be a shadow compromise because the critics are arguing that Al-Zaidi is a clean face for the same old power structures by putting forward a young, wealthy entrepreneur. The pro-Iran militias basically can claim that they are reforming the government while maintaining control over the ministries behind the scene. So nothing really changes there. Now, why is Baghdad and Ali Al-Zaidi very, very important for IRGC and Iran? Now, what is the IRGC factor in this? If the critics are also fearful that if the IRGC is able to successfully consolidate power in Baghdad once again, it will create what they term as a Shia energy crescent. That effectively holds the global economy completely hostage. This is not just a regional political shift, it is a fundamental restructuring of world's energy security because as of late April 2026, the implications are already becoming very, very clear. The energy blockade strategy we have seen that IRGC has implied has already demonstrated its willingness to weaponize geography. With the loyalist government now in control in Iraq, IRGC will gain a strategic depth that extends from Afghan border to the Mediterranean. Now, the control of Strait of Hormuz is also very, very important because the closure of the Strait of Hormuz since March has already pushed the Brent crude oil prices past $120 a barrel, which has triggered significant increase of oil prices globally as well as in South Asia as well. If IRGC prevails to maintain its dominance in Iraq, then this closure could basically transition from a temporary war tactic to a permanent geopolitical toll booth because the Iranians and the IRGC has made it very, very clear that they would be putting up a system where, they would be collecting toll or taxes, or taxes from the ships that will be passing through the Strait of Hormuz. They already also last week issued a public statement, saying that they would be issuing permits for the ships that want to pass through Strait of Hormuz just to make sure that the Strait of Hormuz stays in tight control of IRGC and Iran. Also, the logistical dominance that they gain by controlling both the Iran and the Iranian and the Iraqi ports, IRGC then can easily dictate terms to global shipping. We are already seeing those reports, as I said, where they have tried to set up a toll booth system with intermediate brokerage firms which are basically linked to IRGC have tried to manage these transit permits through the Gulf. What's its impact going to be on the oil and energy markets? And it's going to be big. And Iran solidarity would mean that 20% of global oil production falls direct or indirectly under the influence of IRGC. The production drop collectively from the Gulf with Kuwait, Iran, Saudi and UAE have dropped for about 10 million barrels per day from mid-March due to the conflict. And IRGC's control over Baghdad then ensures that its supply remains always at risk and will keep the prices volatile globally. Now, the Asian vulnerability is huge because China and India are particularly exposed in this as they account for roughly 75% of their oil exports from the region. A consolidated IRGC power base will force these nations into long-term, possibly unfavorable strategic dependencies on Tehran, and that is not going to augur well for India at all. India was importing large part of oil from Iraq before the conflict erupted, so the crude oil supply from Iraq was one of India's main suppliers as well. What is the threat to the regional infrastructure here? Now, what is IRGC also threatening here on the regional infrastructure? The IRGC is not only talking about, targeting tankers, they are also targeting the digital and physical backbone of their rivals. They have already openly spoken about infrastructure sabotage and carried out attempts to sabotage these infrastructures as well. Now, recent reports from April 22nd onwards have highlighted that IRGC-linked media channels have mapped undersea internet cables and cloud data centers in UAE and Bahrain. They are signaling that if their grip on the power in Baghdad is challenged, they can darken the entire Persian digital economy. So they're basically issuing a threat saying that, if they lose power in Baghdad, then this war will be continuing and it will have devastating effect on the digital economy of the Gulf, something the Gulf countries are going to be very, very skeptical about. That is why we have seen tit-for-tat strikes happening. We saw devastating attacks happening on energy hubs like Qatar's Ras Laffan and the South Pars gas field. If IRGC prevails, these facilities then remain permanent targets if the West attempts to bypass the Iranian influence. What is the geopolitical realignment that can happen here? And that is Saudi Arabia and UAE will be forced into what we call a survivalist diplomacy, where they might either have to escalate this militarily with Iran with the help of US and Israeli support, or they will have to find a cold peace with the dominant Tehran, which is going to be very, very dominant in the region. What does it entail for the West and US? They will fail a total failure of containment. EU has already designated IRGC as a terrorist entity, but honestly, control in Iraq would make this designation, pretty much functionally impossible without actually going on to a full-scale war with them. Israel will potentially face a land bridge of IRGC influence, which will be stretching to its borders. That will likely lead to more frequent long-range kinetic exchanges, which might be state as well as non-state actors involved in those kinetic exchanges. So Israel basically would be embroiled in the conflict with Iran going forward as well. What is the current outlook and how do things look at the moment from here? So basically, Al-Zaidi has until May 27th to form his cabinet. His true colors will emerge during this period, because if his cabinet is filled with technocrats and independents, then it will signal a genuine pivot towards US and the Gulf states, something Donald Trump would really, really prefer. But if his cabinet gives key portfolios of security and oil to the Coordination Framework hardliners, then the IRGC man narrative is going to stick in the US, and it will trigger a swift return, which will see a maximum pressure rhetoric from the White House, on sanctions and further actions. Now, this transition is very, very critical in regional logistics and the Strait of Hormuz control, as the failure to balance power in Baghdad between US and Iran, these powers could lead to further shipping disruptions or sanctions that would directly impact the oil, fertilizers, and chemical supplies in South Asia, and it will trigger a global, energy crisis as well. Thank you.